Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 146. Reviews of Will Eisner's The Spirit, a celebration of 75 years, and Blazing Quantum.
Countdown for blast off. X-5, 4, 3, 2, X-1, fire.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode of the podcast, we're going to be looking at two releases. One is the Will Eisner's The Spirit, a celebration of 75 years collection from DC Comics. And then after that, we're going to look at a mini-comic titled Blazing Quantum, and this is written by William Quiaps Ibanez. But before we get to those, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. All of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Now, we're in the last days of July, but you can still get those specials if you order now. Sometimes you'll find that those specials are at 45% off cover price. Sometimes they're 50% off cover price, but often you're going to find discounts that are better than that.
That's right, and as usual, they have a load of bundles to take advantage of where you can get a deeper discount on multiple comics from the same publisher than you would get if you ordered those comics individually. And this month they have no fewer than 6 bundles from DC Comics, including DC Kids, New Series, Returning Series, and Vertigo, along with bundles from Marvel, Dynamite, and Valiant, so you can check those out.
Yep, they have great discounts. You can't beat it with a stick. And why would you want to? So go to their website, dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do pre-order your comics there, be sure to send those guys an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So, Andy, we've got a lot to discuss today, especially when it comes to the Spirit 75th Anniversary Collection, because that's a lot o' comic packed in those two covers. But before we get to those, we want to let our listeners know that we do get their messages, and we appreciate hearing from them. In fact, this week we got 2 recorded messages, one through SpeakPipe and the other through Google Voice. And it's not often that we get responses that way. Usually it's either email, Twitter, or Facebook. So it's kind of a big deal when we get them because they're always fun to listen to.
Yeah, that's true. They always come as a surprise. What's also fun is when we get them through the Google phone account or Google Voice or whatever, that Google tries to do a speech to text. I mean, so some of those are funny because I have no idea what what the person is writing.
Yeah. Well, the first one we got, and I think we got them within a 24-hour period, the 2 recorded messages. The first one is from Dan Scotty, which is great because not only is it wonderful to get a voice message from a listener, but also to get one from one of the creators that we discuss on the show. And remember, we talked about Will Eisner's The Spirit #1 that he did with Matt Wagner last week. So he wanted to respond to our review, and let's listen to what he had to say.
Yeah.
Hello, this is Dan Scotty, artist on Will Eisner's The Spirit. I just listened to your review of issue 1, and I wanted to thank you guys for the insightful and detailed review of the art and the story. I'm in complete agreement with you guys. I really like what Matt's doing on it. And I'm glad to hear your thoughts on Ebony. He's actually my favorite character to draw, and every time I get a new script, I always kind of skim through to get to the Ebony parts just because I like him so much. And I'd be interested to see what you guys think of the series as it goes forward. So thanks again, love the show, and I'll definitely be checking out We Stand on Guard because your guys' review of it makes it seem pretty keen. All right, talk later.
Well, that was really nice to hear from Dan, and to get some feedback on what we've talked about with regards to that Will Eisner The Spirit comic. And I don't know about you, but we got a preview of the second issue, a review copy of that in the email, and I took a look at that, and that series continues to look good.
Yeah, I know that I've mentioned a few times on the show my decision last year to kind of taper back from single issues, but this new Spirit title is one that I'm definitely getting all the issues to, so I'm not going to wait for the trade for that one. So thanks, Dan, for sending that message to us through SpeakPipe, and in fact, we encourage everyone to leave us a message via SpeakPipe. That'd be cool.
Yes.
But the aforementioned Google Voice message is from Carla Ventresca, and I think I'm pronouncing that name correct. And in fact, I think the translation of her message, I read that first before I listened to it, and it didn't make a lot of sense completely. But then listening to it, it was much clearer. So let's listen to what Carla had to say about the show.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Carla. I'm a first-time listener, and I just want to say how much I really enjoyed your show. I will definitely keep listening. I tuned in today because a friend of mine, Tim Comrie, his work was reviewed, and you did a beautiful job, and I actually learned a whole lot more about his work. He has very complex work, and you articulated it so well, and so I really appreciate it, and I will definitely continue to tune in. Thank you so much.
And I think that's great because, Carla mentioned that she is friends with Tim Comrie, and it sounds like Tim not only has provided us with material to discuss on last week's show, but also has provided us with a new listener.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim, for sharing the show with others, and we were glad to talk about your comics. Now, that one, when Google translated that one from speech to text, it mentioned us discussing Tim Conway and not Tim Comrie. So it's interesting that it would Tim Conway was in that whatever speech to texts available proper nouns, but there are probably more than enough opportunities for us to talk about Tim Conway as well.
Yeah. And I can't remember if we've ever brought up Dorf on golf on this show, but maybe we should start talking about the Dorf videos.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think there's better Tim Conway vehicles to talk about.
Yeah, that was kind of a sad part toward the end of his career, I guess. But in
addition to the Carol Burnett show, I have a fondness for They Went That Away and That Away.
I have not seen They Went That Away and That Away.
I saw that when I was a kid.
Yeah, I used to love the Carol Burnett show, though.
Yep. Okay, so now we have talked about Tim Conway.
Now we have, that's right. So now, Carla, if you want to call again and leave us another message referencing Tim Conway, that would be fine. But we've also gotten other messages over the past week, and we got a lot. On Twitter, James Burton, and James Burton is a illustrator and the creator behind Angry Brain Artworks. He recommended our podcast on Twitter, and he said, I like the two guys with PhDs a lot. Their reviews are in-depth and very focused on the indie market. I actually prefer their reviews to any others. So, and he tweeted out to a few of his friends. So, James, thank you very much for that wholehearted recommendation. That goes a long way.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, so in fact, if you want to find out about James and his work, go to angrybrainartworks.com. That's one word, Angry Brain Artworks. And then we got a message via email from a longtime listener of the show who every now and again gets in touch with us, sometimes via email, sometimes on Facebook. But this was an email he sent. This is Pascal Hammond. And he wrote in reference to our last On Location show, because Andy, if you remember, I think I mentioned it to you, some of the customers, the regulars who come by and talk at my local shop for the monthly On Location show had been to San Diego, and so most of the show was about what happened in San Diego. Well, apparently Pascal was there as well, and he says in his email, first, kudos to the Comics Alternative crew for continued great work on the podcast. I enjoyed listening to the most recent On Location show. The guests were fun and informative. I just wanted to chime in about SDCC that I attended as well. I've been attending since 2010, so I never experienced the good old days when comics ruled the con. However, I still think the SCDD comics experience is really what you decide to make of it. I mostly focus on comics-related events, and in terms of panel quality and diversity, San Diego is heads and shoulders above New York Comic-Con, that I also attend. Yes, Artist Alley is cramped and unpleasant compared to New York Comic-Cons, but it also features very approachable A-list regulars. Where else can you have a chat with Bruce Timm or Mac Mignola? Also, an artist can be hard to get at the publisher's booth, which with ticketed lines when there's much more approachable in Artist Alley. It was the case for Chip Zdarsky and Jason Latour this year. It would be a mistake to ignore it. With careful planning, it can be an amazing comics experience. In 5 days, I managed to attend a dozen panels, the Eisner Awards, complete 25 signings, and squeezed in 4 pilot screenings for good measure. Of course, I stayed away from Hall H this year. I hope you guys get to go. I would love to hear your coverage of this madness. Take care, Pascal. So that's a good, meaty letter. Thank you, Pascal.
Yeah, thanks, Pascal. That's interesting that that shows what really good planning can get you even at a busy con like San Diego. Though from what I've heard in several different places, that it seemed easier to navigate San Diego this year than previous years. So whatever problems they were having seems that they've worked on them.
Yeah, so I've got to go at least once in my life.
Yeah, I suppose. I'm gonna just reserve my hotel now for my 50th birthday year. So that'll be 4 years from now.
We also got a couple of other emails, just real brief messages. One, Dan Stafford, who oversees Kilgore Books and Comics, thanked us for discussing a couple of weeks ago Kilgore Quarterly, number 6, and so he appreciated that. Thank you, Dan, for the contact and the issues of Kilgore Quarterly 6. We had a fun time reading it. And then also on this month's webcomics episode, we discussed one creator, her comic, Black is the Night. It's by Julia Graffair. And Andy Wolverton and I mispronounced her name. Now, her name is spelled G-F-R-O umlaut R-E-R. And for some reason, Andy and I thought maybe the G was silent, but that it rhymed with despair, so we were calling her Ferrer. But apparently it's Graffair. So, Julia, thank you for helping us to get the pronunciation of your name at least more correct than we did on the webcomics episode.
Yeah.
And by the way, her book, Black is the Night, we discovered later that it's out of print. That not only can you not get it on Amazon.com, but you can't even get it through Fantagraphics anymore. So if you guys want to get a copy of that, then lobby the people at Fantagraphics and say, hey, bring Black is the Night back into print.
Yep.
But you can still read it on Study Group Comics.
Good. You know, we may be getting to a place in which we have to do an extra show that's just listener mail.
I know, that's getting longer and longer section, it seems, as the weeks go by. But that's good. I like to hear from listeners.
Yep.
So maybe let's let our listeners hear from us in discussing the first book for this week.
Yep.
And this is the brand new collection from DC Comics, Will Eisner, The Spirit, a celebration of 75 years. Now, God, I know you and I have discussed The Spirit both loosely and in a focused way on past episodes, last week's being a case in point, where we discussed the first issue of Dan and Matt's new Spirit series. But this is the first time we've actually looked at a sustained collection of Spirit comics. And I know that both of us have been waiting for this for quite a long time.
Yeah, that's true. This is in fitting with a series of 75th anniversary massive hardcover collections that DC is doing, or has done, including Batman, Superman, the Joker, and Lois Lane each got their own. I think Robin got his own as well, and the Justice Society, and so on. So these are nice books. They're big books. They're also a bit expensive. This one runs about $50, and I've been looking forward to this for a couple reasons. One of which was just to tell a quick story. Last year, and I think I probably mentioned this on the show, but last year I was teaching the comics class that I normally teach, and one of the assignments I like to do at the start is to have students read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, and then have them read the DC's collection, The Best of the Spirit, and then they have to pick a Spirit story out of that collection and analyze it using McCloud's concepts and terminology.
Oh, that's cool.
But last year, I discovered, just not very long before school started, that The Best of the Spirit was out of print. And so I scrambled with my bookstore, and they couldn't get any more copies of that, but they could get enough copies for my class of the second collection that DC put out, which was The Spirit Femme Fatales, which was a collection that focused on the many, many female characters that the Spirit had run-ins with. That collection was not as successful, I have to say, as The Best of the Spirit. There was some overlap between the two collections, but it just was, some of the stories were really not the best examples of Eisner's work. So I was wondering what DC was doing, if they'd lost the license to the Spirit or what, but then we see this 75th anniversary collection, which I think is basically what's replacing those other collections. The $50 price point makes it difficult to use, however, in a class, I have to say.
Yeah, well, with some of their hardbound books, I don't know about the 75th anniversary ones that they've been doing. Who knows what they'll do with that, but I'm hoping, as with their usual hardbound editions, they'll come out with a soft cover.
Maybe.
I mean, it would still be a little pricey, but it would be more manageable.
Yeah, that's true. They're big books, though.
Yeah, or they could pare down from this maybe another best of collection.
Yeah. And most of the best of collection is in here.
How many pages? What? Because I did not get that best of collection because I have all the Spirit Archive collections, and so there was no need, and I never used it in the classroom. Although that's a great idea, I wish I had. But how many pages was that best of?
I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was around. I want to say 180 pages, maybe.
Wow, so much more containable.
Yeah. So there would be probably close to 20 maybe spirit stories in there.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's something substantive, more than enough to work with in the classroom. Now, this new collection, the 75th Anniversary Edition, is just over 475 pages. So it is a hefty tome, and not only hefty in terms of the page count. I have to say, of all of the comics, like hardbound editions of comics that we have been discussing over the past 3 years, and it's almost been exactly 3 years. We'll talk a little more about that next week. This has to be the most solid book I've held in my hand. It's not too big, like let's say a DC or Marvel omnibus, to where your arm gets tired and you can't hold it up for very long. It is a little heavy, but not too heavy. But this is a solid book. Every time I picked it up to prepare for this week's show, I kept thinking, wow, that's a good feeling book.
Yeah.
Did you feel that as well?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it is manageable for its size. Yeah,
and I think it's well put together, not only in terms of the story collections, but just the binding, the tightness, everything. I mean, this is something that's going to last quite a while.
Yep.
It may be a little pricey, but I think it is worth the cost.
Okay.
So there's that. But I guess we want to talk about the innards.
Yep.
There's a lot in here. I mean, these stories run the gamut. For obvious reasons, it begins with the very first Spirit story, The Origin of the Spirit, which was published June 2nd of 1940. And it ends with Darwin Cook's Crime Convention. It's that Batman Spirit crossover he did with Jeff Loeb. So, so you do get some stories, some Spirit stories that weren't written or drawn by Will Eisner, and we can talk about those. But this does give a good sampling, I would guess, of the Spirit, especially for those uninitiated.
Yeah, it's a pretty huge sampling. I mean, the vast majority of stories are the first 400 pages of this book, basically, at least, if not more, are stories from the original Spirit inserts that appeared in newspapers from 1940 to 1952, and then one later Spirit story that Eisner did for the first kitchen sink volume of reprints that only ran 2 issues in 1973, and then 2 stories from the kitchen sink series, The Spirit New Adventures.
Right.
And that ran 8 issues. And then finally, the Batman Spirit one-shot. But nothing from after that.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the newspaper inserts, and you and I know what that refers to. But for those who are not familiar with the history of the Spirit, or who don't know much about Will Eisner, maybe they're just discovering the Spirit for the first time. Unlike most of the collections, definitely the DC collections, the 75th anniversary collections, in any other collected editions that you're going to find, these did not come out in individual comic books. The Spirit was, at least the original Spirit, first came out in these newspaper inserts that became known as the Spirit section of the newspapers. And so they were shipped to a variety of newspapers across the country, and the first, at least half of it were new Spirit stories, but then there were a couple of backup series as well. So these could be found in a variety of newspapers between 1940 and 1952. So that's where they originated. So it was very different because newspaper comics we usually think of in terms of strips. Then if they're in color, they appear in the Sunday editions. And these were in color, these were in Sunday editions, but they were not stripped. They were, for the most part, at least the spirit stories themselves, anywhere from 7 to 8 pages. And so they were good-sized stories. And they were about the same size as comic book stories were at the time because many issues of comics had more than one story in them. So it was, I guess, comparable to that. So even within a 7 or 8 page spread, which you may think of as a relatively limited space to tell a complete story, this shows the adeptness at Will Eisner, not only as an artist, but I think primarily as a storyteller. In reading through the vast majority of this collection, I was just amazed or just reminded of how incredible of a storyteller Eisner was, able to take 7 pages and make it a complete story in such a way that, I don't know about you, but I was contrasting it with the final contributions to this collection that are good, the ones that Eisner didn't do. These are good stories, but I think the storytelling, even though they were a little longer, didn't satisfy as much as these 7 and 8 pagers of the original Spirit. So I was just really struck by the feeling again that, wow, I mean, to take a few pages to tell a complete story in such a way that you got a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's just amazing, each one of these.
Yeah. There's a good selection of many of the ones that Eisner did that were more along the experimental lines. Mm-hmm. One of the things he wanted to do with the Spirit was, he not only had kind of ambitions for the series as short stories, which he often kind of modeled on the O. Henry style of short story, and that was one of the ambitions he had, was to be comparable to O. Henry in that work, and then but also to push the boundaries of what sorts of things could be done in a comic. Each of the Spirit stories, except for, I guess, the very first one that we have in here, but each one after that, for example, he uses a splash page at the beginning that serves as a sort of cover for the story, and those are often some of the more creative choices that Eisner made in putting together, or in putting together his stories. But then there's also stories that are just really, really kind of straight experiments with style and so on, like Two Lives, which tells 2 parallel stories on different pages, and what was the other one? 10 Minutes.
10 minutes, yeah.
Is meant to take place in the amount of time it takes about to read the story. The story of Rat-Tat-Tat, the toy machine gun, is in rhyme. It's almost like a children's story. And in looking at the table of contents and the dates, it always struck me as interesting that those 2 stories, Rat-Tat-Tat and 10 Minutes, came out consecutively, one after the other. Rat-Tat-Tat and then Rat-Tat, in 10 Minutes. So that shows, and I think the fact too that the bulk of these stories that we get in here come from that immediate post-war period, really 1946 to 1949, where Eisner is really at his creative peak during those 3 years.
Right. Now, I want to talk about some of the stories that aren't included here, or at least sections of the Spirit's history that aren't there, that gets back to the war, because we have a few things to say there. But on the topic of the experimentation of form, one of the first places where I noticed this chronologically is the story that came out in January 4th, 1942, and that is Gorilla Gauge. And this is one that begins on page 63 for those of you following at home. And one of the things I loved about this is the way that Eisner plays around with repetition, not only of text in terms of what the various characters are saying, but also panel size and image. You have different sounds like the sleeping sound of the cat and the screaming of a woman, and then the rat-a-tat-tat of a gun. And all of these sound effects are represented, at least visually speaking, in ways that are similar. And then on this first page, after the splash page, this is on 64, when they realize that all of this chaos, all of this violence is the result of Gorilla Gauge, you find, let's say in one panel, a policeman writing down Gorilla Gauge, and then a citizen saying Gorilla Gauge, and then Commissioner Dolan saying Gorilla Gauge, and then finally on that page, the Spirit, Gorilla Gauge again. And we have many instances in this short story of this same kind of repetition. For instance, on page 68, which is the third to the last page, that middle strip where Ellen, Dolan, Gorilla Gauge, and the Spirit are all making short, brief comments. Spirit, 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 oh. I mean, just playing around. So I think both that's an experiment with storytelling form, but also you can see that Eisner is really having fun here.
Yeah, he is.
So I think that gives you a sense. I mean, I agree with you that it was, after the war, it seems like in many ways he was really feeling his oats. But even fairly early on in 1942, with this Gorilla Gauge piece, it really is noticeable as well.
Yeah, and one of the things to mention too that the introduction mentions is that, or the beginning is mentioned that Eisner used a lot of assistance for the entire run of the series, and so one of the things that stands out, I think, the most in that Gorilla Gauge is the stuff you talked about, and that comes down to the lettering. How each one of those Gorilla Gauges on page 64 is in a different font,
right?
And same with the Spirit and the O's on page 68, and so that may not have been Eisner doing the lettering, but definitely Eisner directing the letterer to, play around in that way.
Right, visualizing his idea even in a kind of a rough way. So that's good. And another early comic that I wanted to comment on before we get to the war is, and this does have to do with the war, the Tale of the Dictator's Reform, and this. This is a comic that came out June 22nd, 1941. So keep in mind, this is after World War II started, but before the United States entered the war, which is December 1941, for those who are not up on their history. But here we have a story, and the main character, in addition to the Spirit, is Adolf Hitler.
Right, though he's never named and his country of origin is never identified.
Exactly.
And even later on in the story, when he returns home, the swastikas on the flags are obscured, but not enough to hide what we know they are.
Oh, I mean, yeah, you know exactly who it is, and at one point he's even talking to his minister of propaganda, who. This is Goebbels, and the guy even looks like Goebbels. He's kind of short and thin. But and we won't give anything away to say what happens in this story, but I will say very clever, very, very clever.
Yeah, this is a clever story, and I'm glad you brought this one up, because back in November, when I was doing research at the Billy Ireland Library, I was reading through some of the correspondences that Eisner had received during the time that he was doing the Spirit. And this was one of the stories that generated, as far as what's included in this collection that they have at Billy Iron Library, which may not be everything Eisner ever received, but this is a story that got some controversy from newspaper editors.
Why? What were some of the editors saying?
They were saying that they were receiving letters that basically they didn't want. They were offended by the story that, and again, to note that America's not at war with Germany yet, so there wasn't the kind of rampant anti-Hitler sentiment going on, but more that they just didn't want politics on their comics page. They wanted to keep that out. Now Eisner did receive complaints a lot from one particular newspaper editor, and that was a guy named Philip Love at the Newark Star-Ledger. So from 1940 to 1941, he's almost on a weekly basis. He and Edward Busy Arnold, who ran Quality Comics but also was a partner in the Spirit, are responding to these complaints. So on one hand, to say something, Eisner was getting a lot of complaints, is important to keep in mind that they were mainly from one person. But the Tales of the Dictator's Reform not only got complaints from Philip Love at the Newark Star-Ledger, but others as well. And again, like I said, it was mainly they wanted Eisner to stay away from political content.
Yeah, it's funny today that trying to keep but he's being criticized for representing Hitler in a way that's a little critical. But, as you pointed out, keep in mind, this is before the United States entered the war, before Pearl Harbor. And, the United States, historically speaking, especially since the 19th century, has had a large German population. So, coming in the aftermath of the First World War, the isolationist 20s and into the 30s, I mean, people knew that Germany was up to no good, that something was going on there, but we hadn't thrown our hat in the ring, so to speak. So, who knew what was going to happen? I mean, there were some people who were advocating we could stay out of this thing entirely. It'll just wash by us. We don't have to be entangled in anything going over in Europe, as we were a few decades ago. And not every comics outlet was, let's say, like Captain America, punching Hitler on the very first on the cover of the very first issue of that comic. So, and you're right that creators and especially editors were very wary of becoming politically, at least overt at the time. Now, after America entered the war effort, that was different. But this is before we entered the war.
Yep.
And even especially given that context, it strikes me that. And again, I don't want to give anything away about how the story ends, but it seems that Eisner is not being kind to Adolf Hitler, but he is giving the phenomena of Adolf Hitler a different spin that I guess in a very loose way you could say has a little more heart, even though that's not the right word. But if I say anything more, I'll be giving away the ending of that story. But it's one of the highlights of the early ones, I think.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's in there not only because it's a good story, but because of this historical importance that we're assigning to it. And in fact, in reading through this book, one of the one of the questions I often had when I come to a story is to ask, why is this story in here? Why is this particular story in here? Now, we can't answer that for every single one, of course, because it's way too much to do. But I was curious, and just to jump to the next story after the Adolf Hitler one, The Jewel of Death on page 47, which is another early spirit story. This one's interesting because the spirit wears a white suit and he's in the Middle East. But I was curious as to why that one in particular was there. And then when we get later in the book, and I'm trying to remember which story this is. Yeah. On page 368, Blood of the Earth,
right,
from February 26, 1950, is basically a remake of The Jewel of Death.
But now with sans serif.
Yeah, with sans serif instead of... is there a female?
There's a female. I can't remember her name. Let me turn back.
Yeah, but it isn't one of the regular recurring female characters in the book. Yeah. So I've thought for a minute maybe Satin showed up in that, but she doesn't.
No, I think it's before Silk Satin.
Yep.
So, but yeah, those are the only two places where you see him in a non-blue suit.
Yeah. But also that it's interesting that Eisner did do that. That he, they're not identical stories by any means, but there are definitely parallels, and they're parallel characters and so on who don't, like the Dr. Greg, who doesn't seem to be, the same character that is in one or the other. But the fact that, it's interesting, the fact that Eisner would do something like that. It's almost like a revision, almost like a band doing their song, doing a re-recording of their song later on in their career or something.
Exactly. And that earlier story basically ends with the Egyptian. It's like he's a seer almost. He's a beggar / seer, and he writes in the sand or he draws an image, and it's the face of Denny Colt, the spirit. And then this other story that you mentioned from 1950 in February, Blood of the Earth. It begins, this opening page, the splash page, is of a same type figure introducing things and drawing the image of Danny Colt in the sand.
Yeah. And there's almost 10 years separating those two stories, and it's important to keep in mind too that Eisner was kind of producing this series as disposable entertainment, right? It was stuffed in the funny pages of the Sunday newspaper.
Right. It wasn't anticipated that people would actually hang on to them, or that they would be preserved in any way. So, even in the 1970s, when Eisner came back to comics and to doing the Spirit reprints, one of the things Dennis Kitchen has talked about is how poorly Eisner was caring for his original art pages, because again, he didn't think that this was something that would have a life beyond the week it was published. Mm-hmm. So Eisner was probably not anticipating, someone's going to recognize this callback to a story I did 10 years earlier, because people weren't necessarily hanging on to their spirit sections. And if they were, then they had much more foresight than probably any other reader at the time. Yeah. And speaking of which, do you own any spirit sections? I do not, but I think you do. Yeah, I have 3. I wish I had more. I have 3 of them. I have only one that's complete though. I have only one that has the full 16 pages. That includes not only the spirit story, but the Lady Luck and Mr. Mystic stories. The other 2 are just the spirit stories. One of them, though, let's see if I can find it, actually comes from the collection of Johnny Craig, the EC artist. Wow. So I was really surprised when I found that a little card in there saying that had belonged to him. That's like a double find. Yeah. And that one was
Yeah, and I only paid a few bucks for that. So there you go. Anyway, yeah. So the spirit sections are out there for collectors to get, but they were in, I think, at their peak they were in 20 or 21 newspapers, if I'm remembering right. I don't have all my notes in front of me on the spirit. But even in those 20 or so newspapers, we're still talking of a circulation of about 5 million. So there were more spirit comics available in that 1940 to 1952 period than probably any other comic that was being published at that time.
Yeah, and I think it's this is one of the reasons why Jules Feiffer, who worked with Will Eisner, and we can talk about that later, especially concerning one particular story. It's one of my favorites of this collection.
Oh yeah.
In his 1960s book on superhero history, he included the Spirit, and it was a little unusual at the time to include the character, the Spirit, along with people like Superman, Batman, and all of the others that you would normally think of. But in many ways, it made a lot of sense, especially given the fact that you just pointed out that even though this was in a newspaper supplement, it had a large readership, arguably larger than a lot of these comic books did.
Yeah.
So I think that Feiffer was right to do what he did. Now, I want to get back to something that you were alluding to earlier, and that was the Spirit during World War II.
Right.
Now, Eisner was drafted, and he did go into the military. And between there is a spread, I'm looking at the table of contents, between June 7th, 1942 and December 30th, 1945, there's only one comic, and this is dated April 25th, 1943. So this is while Eisner was in the military, and during that time he had others working on the Spirit for him.
Yeah, that's right. So basically from the story is kind of interesting in that from the middle of, it's around May 1942 where Eisner is drafted and enters the Army, but he's never stationed overseas, as far as I can remember. For the most part, he's stationed in New Jersey, and so he's able to actually, for the first few months anyway, smuggle out scripts for the Spirit. So really, when you're talking about these 1942 to 1945 stories, I would add The Baby King from June 7th, 1942 as one that Eisner may have written a script for. I'm not 100% sure when he stopped writing the scripts, but it's definitely not his art at this point. And then he comes back with the Christmas story from 1945. So the story on page 95, The Return of the Villains of 42, from December 30th, 1945, is the second story that Eisner did upon his return. So the fact that he's returning to a bunch of villains that had previously appeared in the Spirit when he was last doing it is kind of showing the continuity between those two eras. But in the meantime, in that middle section, again, that's only really represented by The Last Mile from 1943, the writers Manly Wade Wellman and William Woolfolk were mainly writing the strip, and artists like Lou Fine and what's the other guy's name? Jack Cole were the primary artists on the Spirit, but they both did a pretty good job of mimicking Eisner's style.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Now you mentioned Lou Fine and Jack Cole. It not just with his work on the Spirit, but his work in comics in general. I mean, for those who may not know much about Will Eisner, it's just amazing the number of people that he worked with. It's basically a who's who of early comics history.
Right.
And some of which you can get by reading that that short graphic novel, The Dreamer, where he, in one form or another, kind of represents some of those people that he had worked with. But getting back to the Spirit, there are a number of those stories during that time where he was in the military that we don't have in this collection.
Yeah, and there's probably good reason for that. If anybody who has the Spirit archives, it's basically, I think, volume 5 through 11 that have the non-Eisner Spirit stories, and they're a real mixed bag. The creators weren't really doing the kind of experimenting. Well, Eisner hadn't really been doing much of the experimenting before 1942 that he would do after the war, but they were also even if you're fans of Jack Cole or Lou Fine, as I am, they're not the best work that those guys did either. So the fact that they do at least though give us one, maybe two representatives from that era does just I think serves the historical purpose with this book of at least giving us a representative.
Mm-hmm. And on the topic of what we've been discussing, certain stories not included or periods of the Spirit's history that we don't have here for various reasons, that leads me to something that you and I were talking about before we started the recording, and that was both the introduction and the final piece that are in this collection, especially the introduction. Now, this is by Neil Gaiman, and it's dated 2005, and you told me that this is the introduction that Gaiman wrote for that Best of Spirit collection, correct? That came out in 2005. Yeah. One of the things that surprised me about this is, given, I guess, the gravity of something like this, right? I mean, this is the Spirit we're talking about. This is Will Eisner we're talking about. The 75th anniversary collection that we're talking about here. You would think, given all of that there would be a brand new introduction to this collection, or at least I assumed there would be a brand new introduction to this collection. And, I mean, Gaiman's intro is good enough. I mean, Gaiman saying a few words about the Spirit, in his experience with reading it. But that was the one part of this book that left me unsatisfied. It just seemed to me that there should be first and foremost, a brand new introduction. Don't retread an old introduction, especially if this is the 75th anniversary collection. Give me something new. It could be by Neil Gaiman. It could be by anyone else. Just give me something new. In addition, it would have been nice for there to have been in an introduction some kind of context. So telling us things like you and I have been discussing, where there are certain periods in the Spirit's history where we may not have as many stories, and for various reasons, why some of the stories were included. I mean, obviously, the first time we see Silk Satin or Pigel, it makes sense to have those. Some of the experimental stories, maybe even make a reference to why some stories weren't included, because you know that there are people who are reading this, and I've already seen this on Goodreads. People are saying, it's good, but where are some of these stories? These are some of my favorites. Everybody's going to have a favorite that they're not going to find here if they're Spirit fans. But I think whoever would write a new introduction could address this as almost a preemptive strike, saying there are certain reasons why we collected the ones that we did. There are other reasons why we didn't collect the other ones. This is what we have. There's so, we could, if you want all of them, get the archives and all those 27 volumes. And so I was just a little disappointed in the reuse of Gaiman's 2005 intro.
Now, there is an ad for the archives in the back.
In the back, right. I mean, that's an ad, but in the introduction, just give me a little more substance.
Well, I have a feeling most of our listeners would drop $50 on a book just for its introduction. So that's important to cover here. But but one of the things I wondered about that in relation to that is that, Dynamite is doing the the new Spirit series,
right?
As we talked about last week. So DC no longer has the license to produce new Spirit work. I'm not sure how much or how long DC has with the Spirit reprints, if this is their last hurrah with that, or if they're going to continue with more reprints, because the archives are all out of print. I mean, you can get them still, but
right. They're not producing more.
No, and they're not producing those other collections. So I wonder if the lack of an introduction, of a new introduction, is just simply a cost-saving measure. They just didn't want to invest more money in this. And that may also explain why there aren't more recent stories in here. That there are only those 3 recent stories, and that they wouldn't have to pay the creators of those stories for much more. So and so that's my speculation on why there isn't a new introduction in here. But with one of the other things that's missing then without that introduction is that, and even though there is a little short piece when we get to page 410 that explains what these new adventures are.
Right.
So there is a little context there. However, one of the things that's missing is credits for the 2 stories that come from
the kitchen sink stuff.
The kitchen sink stuff. The Spirit, the new adventures. So there's The Return of Mink Stole, which starts on page 415, and I do want to go back to the regular Spirit stuff, but since we're on the introduction and stuff for missing, and that story is by Neil Gaiman and Eddie Campbell, but nowhere in the book does it say that.
Right.
And then the next story following that is Last Night I Dreamed of Dr. Cobra, which is a great story, and that's by Alan Moore and Daniel Torres, or the original author and Daniel Torres. And so the fact that those 4 creators are not credited in this book at all is curious.
It is, and I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of it. I like your speculation, linking the lack of credit, especially with those 2 stories, back to what we were discussing previously with the introduction. Maybe it is a cost-cutting measure. Maybe it's a time-saving measure. Maybe it's laziness. I don't know, or at least not good editorial work. Maybe I'm asking too much, but I tell you, if I plop down the money that this goes for at retail, okay, I would like to think that in addition to these reprinted stories, old and new, or newer, that it would come with a halfway decent introduction. And again, Gaiman's introduction from 2005, nothing wrong with that, but that was an introduction written for another volume. And I think it's a little, maybe it's too harsh of a word, disingenuous for DC to reprint something that was intended for another book, because in essence it is another book, even though it deals with the Spirit and it's a collection of the older stories. At the bare minimum, the editors, or one of the editors, maybe even an editorial assistant, not even signing his or her name to this, could write a halfway decent and satisfying introduction, or and get this. Why not get an Eisner scholar to write this? Because you and I know that scholars are not used to getting paid for the kind of things that they write and publish. So conning some scholar into writing something for this to set a context and to provide some information, and then saying, "Hey, your name will be in a high visibility DC publication." That's enough for a lot of scholars to say, "Yeah, okay, I might do it." They could have included a better introduction, I think, had they tried. The fact that they didn't try makes me wonder and disappoints me.
I think that I now see the subtext of this complaint is that you feel bad that they didn't ask you to write the introduction.
No, I'm not Eisner scholar enough.
Oh, I don't know. You look up look up Eisner in MLA bibliography.
Okay.
And see how many times you show up. And then look at the other ones and see how many times you're cited. You're the guy. You're the Eisner guy.
Well, I mean, honestly, that's not the reason I'm kind of harping on this. Although, now that you say that, maybe I should own up to it. But
I'm just poking.
Yeah. But and then the afterword is by Darwin Cook, and this is another kind of personal recollection, like we have with the Gaiman intro. Now, this one is dated 2006. I don't know when this one was originally published, but I'm assuming that it was a previous publication that came out around 2006.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure of its origin either.
But by no means am I hinging my recommendation and enjoyment of the book on what I think of as kind of a chintzy introduction. Again, not Gaiman's introduction is not good. It's just it's the publisher. They should have done something else. But back to the regularly scheduled program.
Yeah. That's 45 minutes on the introduction. Do you realize I was timing it? So. One of the other things I wanted to mention, you had said earlier that several of the stories in here include first appearances of important characters, like Silk Satin and Pagel, and so on. But there's also a couple stories in here that I think are historically important for other reasons, and so I wanted to mention them really quickly, or probably not very quickly actually. The first one is Little Adam on page 186.
Oh yeah,
July 20th, 1947, and here is the in this story. Someone has killed Al Slap, or has attempted to murder Al Slap, the creator of the incredibly popular comic strip Little Adam, the Stupid Mountain Boy. and the suspects for doing this are, what's his name? Elmer Hay, creator of Little Homeless Brenda, and Hector Gould, the creator of Nick Stacy.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we can kind of get where we're going at here. And so Eisner manages to not only do a nice little parody of the Little Adam and Al Slap, but also Little Orphan Annie and Dick Tracy as Elmer Hay instead of Harold Gray, excuse me, looks like Daddy Warbucks down to the bald head and the completely opaque eyes with no pupils, and then
Gould.
Yeah, Hector Gould has got the chiseled jaw and the fedora of Dick Tracy.
Yeah,
so.
And we almost always see him in profile. I mean, there are a couple of images where we see his face turned at a particular angle, but usually it's at a profile.
Yeah. Now, do you know the story behind this?
No, I don't.
Okay, there's a somewhat interesting story behind this, in that this is according to Eisner later on in his life. He said that Al Cap actually called him and offered this idea: wouldn't it be funny if we set up a fake feud, and you parody me in The Spirit, and I will parody you in Little Abner? And so Eisner agreed to that. He thought that would be fun. So that's where Little Adam came out. However, after that strip came out, Eisner looked at Lil Abner and kept waiting, and nothing showed up there. Al Cap never actually reciprocated the feud. Now, Al Cap did have feuds with other creators. Some of them were manufactured, but though Chester Gould, I don't know how much he ever said about Fearless Fosdick, but I can't imagine that he was super happy with that character.
Right.
Especially because also Al Cap licensed that character out to advertisers. But it was around this time that Al Cap actually sued the syndicate that was carrying Little Abner for quite a bit of money in order to regain the rights to the character. And it's a really complicated lawsuit, so I won't get into the details of it. But it was also a landmark lawsuit in terms of creators' rights. And so Eisner seems to think that there may have been some kind of connection going on there between the two. And or at the very least, Eisner may have been aware of that lawsuit and be also parodying it in this story, because part of the mystery hinges on the syndicate owners who run Little Adam. So Al Cap was apparently, from all reports, not a really nice guy.
No, not a warm and fuzzy kind of fellow.
No. On another side, another kind of footnote to this is that Harvey Kurtzman, in one of his Hey Look comics, does a parody of this story, kind of showing how the parody of a parody of a parody of a parody kind of goes down the rabbit hole of one cartoonist parodying another, and so on and so on.
Well, when Dark Horse comes out, and then Dennis Kitchen with the the collection, the Kurtzman Library collection of Hey Look.
Yeah.
That'll be something to look forward to.
Yeah, it's just a one-pager, and it really, I can't imagine it would make any sense to anybody outside of the business. It seems like a real inside baseball type of strip, but it is an interesting footnote to this story. And, I think that Eisner is really having fun with this at the very least, and it's not necessarily mean-spirited, but it does take some shots at all the creators involved, not just Al Cap.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that is one of the fun stories in this collection. Of course, all of them are fun, but in terms of humor, not all of them are. In fact, one of the things that is notable about many of the stories in this collection is just how stark the tone Eisner sets in many of these. And this is something, I've always felt, not so much with the spirit stories, but with his comics, let's say after the late 1970s, right, where he's, Contract with God and then everything after that. There are some comics, some graphic novels, if we want to call them that he created that are a little sentimental, I guess you could say, kind of warm and fuzzy. And so because of those, and I think The Dreamer, I mentioned The Dreamer earlier, that's one of those that strike me as not his most sentimental, but it's one that I would put into that category of sentimentalism, or at least Eisner sentimentalism. And that stands in stark contrast to some of the other books that he created. I think most the darkest, for me at least, is Dropsy Avenue. And you put something like The Dreamer or The Building next to Dropsy Avenue, and oh my God, to notice the difference in tone between those two, to say that the guy who can create something like The Building or Invisible People can also create something like Dropsy Avenue. Dropsy Avenue is, as many of the stories in this collection, it just ends in a way that has you almost breathless. You're going, oh my God, why end there? And so I think that is the realist, or maybe even the naturalist side of Will Eisner coming out. And there are a variety of examples of those kind of stories in this collection. But again, you have the more humorous ones, like the one you just mentioned that parodies Al Capp and Company.
Mm-hmm. I've always felt, though, with Eisner, especially on the Spirit, that is that the not just the sentimental side, but the kind of excessive emotionalism of his stories really came out in the Spirit, especially. So even when the story takes a darker turn, Eisner could draw a kid cry. Like those tears are bountiful anytime, and this happens several times in this book where a kid cries. And I know there's been some scholars who've compared it to, like, for example, the Jewish theater, and that form of acting showing up in Eisner's comics, and I think that makes sense. But if we can stick to the humor side for a minute, the one other story I wanted to reference in relationship to Lil Adam and stories of historical importance is one I think that you've alluded to also in this discussion, which is on page 382, Happy New Year.
Oh yeah.
And that's this one's important because it is one that actually Pfeiffer by this time was pretty much writing the series with input sometimes from Eisner.
And it's also a parody.
Yeah. And this one is, in this one, Eisner's assistant, who's not named, but we can assume it's Pfeiffer, comes in late on New Year's Eve and murders Eisner, and then takes over the strip to tell the story that he wanted to tell. And this strip actually it's drawn in the style that Pfeiffer used for his children's series Clifford. Mm-hmm. And it's cute in that way, but it's basically a recap of the stories that had appeared in the Spirit in 1950. So there may be some references that the readers don't quite get, though we do get a lot of the 1950 stories in this collection. But then it ends with a really interesting approach to breaking the fourth wall, where the Pfeiffer character actually steps through a panel grid and sees us reading the book. That's almost like something Grant Morrison does now.
Right.
And so Eisner was already playing around with that metatextuality, and he does that actually several times. There's also stories in which, at least one story, where a character is reading the story that he is appearing in. Mm-hmm. So, but this is probably the most overt example of that playfulness, and again, we probably credit it to Pfeiffer, though Eisner had a hand in it.
Yeah. This is a really important one. I think it was important for me. There were several years ago I gave a paper on an MLA panel where I was discussing a few of Eisner's autobiographical graphic novels, but in a way in which he demonstrated a kind of metatextual self-awareness of what he was doing. Because just because you're writing in an autobiographical mode doesn't necessarily mean that it's metafictional, or it turns back on itself, or it's consciously aware of itself. But I was focusing on those works that do. And I started off by referencing this story. And, even though it is, in many ways a Pfeiffer story. What they do here with, you mentioned at the very beginning and especially at the very end where he's stepping through the actual panel and confronts the reader. He says, "Now I know you. You're the one who watches us every week. All you ever do is stare. This time you are part of this adventure. You can't escape, not even by turning this page. There must be no witness to what I've done." And then he points a gun, and you see the barrel sticking up, consuming almost one entire panel, and then a big bang. So in many ways, depending on how you read, there's a double murder in this story because this assistant, the Pfeiffer character, comes in and murders Eisner, and then he murders the reader. But then Eisner wakes up. Was it a dream?
Yeah. And again, that breaking the fourth wall. I mean, that's almost exactly what Morrison does in Ultra Comics, in the Multiversity Ultra Comics, telling the reader, don't turn the page, you can't escape, or telling the reader to turn the page and close the book and don't keep going. That idea we can see, if not the first, one of the first examples of that metatextuality in comics.
Yeah.
So, were there any other stories that stood out to you in this collection as significant in one way or the other?
Well, and I think both you and I were probably planning on bringing this up, but this is the story of Gerhard Schnobel. That's one. This is on 235. That is a classic, and it is one of those stories, and there are a lot like this, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this up. Not just because this is a great and I think a classic Spirit story, but this is also one where the Spirit plays a tangential role. Not every Spirit story, in this collection or otherwise, centers on Denny Colt, the Spirit.
Right.
Many times it'll be about something else or some other character, some other figure, usually someone who is just in this installment, and that's it. Just like the title character here, Gerhard Schnobel, who they come in and then they leave at the end, and that's the only time we'll see them for the most part. And the Spirit may make an appearance. It's almost as if his story kind of bumps up against the story of this other character's, and that's all the role that he'll play. And I think this is a great example of that. And there's several of those kind of stories in this collection, but this is one that on the splash page, Eisner tells us, almost like a voiceover, before we begin this story, we want to make one point very clear. This is not a funny story. This is in the funny pages, right? So this is not a funny story. We mean to give you a simple account of Gerhard Schnobel beginning at the point when he first discovered he could fly. Please, no laughter. And then we get his story. Now, this is one, I guess you could put this into the sentimental Eisner category. But to me, this is not dripping sentimentality. I mean, there is that heart tug, the emotion that's there. But again, I think this is just so well done, and it's a very simple, stripped-down story that I can excuse the emotion.
I agree. I mean, I think that's one of the stories where that sentimentality really works. There may be others where it's more overwrought, but I do love that story, and that is probably my all-time favorite Spirit story. Also, one that I was lucky to see an exhibit of Eisner original art a few years ago, and they had all the pages of that story, and that was really impressive to me, especially how Eisner worked in the collage aspect, because a couple of the pages have photographic backgrounds, and especially the second page, and so how he had done that was really interesting to see that on the original page. And I think that these original pages were reproduced in the IDW book as well.
Right, that first volume.
Yeah. So one of the stories that I wanted to mention, not just because it's important to this collection, but is actually important to me, is the Christmas Spirit of 1948, featuring Basher Brains on page 263. Eisner did a Christmas story every year, and that was one of the things he loved to do. Even when he returned in 1945 to the Spirit, the first thing he did was a Christmas story. But this one's from 1948, and one of the reasons why I wanted to mention this is that it has that sentimentality that you were talking about, but also this was the first Spirit story I ever remember reading. And on page 267, there's the picture of Basher Brains revealing in the Santa Claus costume, revealing to the kid that he's not Santa Claus, but the kid is blind and can't see that. That there's your sentimentality right there in a nutshell. But also that image stayed with me for a long time, especially the kid with the completely black lenses on the glasses. And the time I remember reading this was when I was pretty young. I think I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I was getting my hair cut, and the barber had a stack of Warren comics, and I pulled the Spirit out of that stack and started reading it, and it happened to have this. It was this. I think it was the Warren did a Christmas special or something like that. And it had this story in it. There's probably a lot of other things that if I had pulled out of a pile of Warren comics when I was 9 years old would have had a much different impression on me. But that was the one. That was the one I got. And so from then on, it kind of always, the Spirit as just a kind of iconic figure, not even a story per se, always stuck with me from that time on.
Huh. I'm glad that you brought this one up for a couple reasons. One, the art in this story. In reading back through this for this collection, and I hadn't thought of this before, but the way that the panels are laid out, in some slight way, it reminds me of what Mark Buckingham does with Fables. And now it's not the same thing, but it just reminds me of that, because one of the things I love about Buckingham's work, especially once he really got into Fables after the first couple of arcs that he was on, is that, and you can see it to this day, when we're wrapping up appropriately enough the Fable series, the borders that he includes in various stories that are being told in Fables have something to do with the context. If it's something to do with the Frog Prince, then you'll have images of a frog. If something takes place out on the farm, then you have an image of the farm location. And these serve as kind of borders. Now, in this Spirit, the Christmas Spirit of 1948, you don't have the exact same thing, but the story proper, for the most part, are those, I guess if you look at each 2-page spread, those 8 panels that are at the center of the 2-page spread. And then there are 2 long vertical panels on each side of that these 4 panels that run horizontal, the 2 strips, kind of overlap slightly. These 2 vertical long panels on each side of the 2-page spread serve 2 functions. One, they're decorative, and they do set a context, like the little images that are above and below these 8 panels that sit at the center of the pages. But they also become part of the story itself. And so I think, like for instance, you see on page 265, as Santa is talking with Basher Brains, you see the 2 kids coming out at night of their apartment. And, of course, they look lonely, forlorn. There's snow outside. But that does become a part of the story. But then if you turn the page and look at something similar on page 267, then you get an interaction between Basher Brains and, let's say, the blind boy, who are conversing in those 8 panels that sit at the center of this 2-page spread. But you get a continuation of that conversation in that long vertical panel that runs down the side of 267. And I just think that that's a very it's an interesting and also an experimental, getting back to Eisner's experimental way of telling this story.
Yeah, and I think that raises another point that I think is really useful for anybody reading this book, is that you really get a sense of Eisner's progress through this 12-year period in his career, where if you look at those very early stories, he sticks pretty strictly to, the 3-tier, usually 9-panel grid page structure,
right,
or layout, and doesn't really vary from that, but does play around with it a little bit, like in that one story that you were mentioning earlier, with the different characters saying "oh" in really narrow panels.
Right.
But here you really see him playing around with the page itself, and that is really interesting.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you brought up this Christmas story for that reason. But the other reason is you mentioned that this was the first spirit story you ever read when you were a kid. Honestly, I don't remember the first spirit story that I read, but I do recall what I thought of at the time in terms of the spirit. And see if this makes sense to you. When I was a kid, one of my favorite comics, Mad Magazine. As many of us who grew up. And, growing up, really beginning to read comics in the 1970s, obviously I wasn't even alive during the days of origin,
right,
when Mad was a comic book. But every now and again, Mad Magazine would reprint in various forms those earlier stories. I loved those. I absolutely ate them up every time, like the super specials and all of that. When I first encountered, and I can't even remember not only what it was, but how I was reading spirit stories, but I remember reading spirit stories and thinking that the art is like that I would see from the old Mad comics. And I didn't know who these creators were at the time, but the feeling is I felt the same way reading The Spirit as I did the Will Elder stories or even the Wally Wood stories. And of course, it's significant enough that Wally Wood did work with Will Eisner on some of these spirits, especially later. But in very different art styles, but sometimes in the way that Eisner would draw characters and the way that characters reacted wasn't completely dissimilar to some of the things that you found from, let's say, Elder and Wood in Mad.
No, absolutely not. Like I actually thought of that too. Like whenever a character gets shot, it really looks like the way Elder and Wood would draw someone getting shot. Like if you look at page 179 at April Fool, when what's the byline, the reporter who's pulling this April Fool's joke is pretending to be killed at the beginning. That looks like a Mad sequence right there.
Yeah, you're right.
And that's one of the stories. There's a lot of speaking of that story for a minute, there's a lot of the stories in this collection that deal with this kind of irony in which somebody creates a prank or a joke or a fictional situation that ends up coming true by the end of the story. And so in this story, Byline, who's this reporter who's screwing around a lot, creates a fake story that two of the richest men in Central City have kill each other in a suicide pact, and then of course that is, spoiler alert, is what ends up happening. But there's a handful of stories in here in which Eisner pulls out that story structure again.
Exactly, and one of those is another one of my favorites, and this is The Valentine from February 20th, 1949. Yeah, you have two guys who are at the post office, and they're looking at their dead letters, right? Letters that couldn't really go anywhere, didn't have any recipient. And so I think they have 4 of them, and they decide, well, it's Valentine's Day, or at least a little bit after Valentine's Day. It would be a shame for these letters, these Valentines of affection, to just sit there and, in essence, be dead in the dead letter office. They prefer not. Let's say. for our Melville fans out there. But anyway, but what they decide is to send them to just 4 people. One of them closes their eyes and just picks 4 people, and it's about what happens when these Valentines go out to people they were never even intended to go out to. And of course, one of them is Ellen Dolan, and of course, you know what's going to happen there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one of those where these people, as with the April Fool's joke, they create a fiction, and then that fiction becomes a reality all its own.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, one of the things I wanted to say about as we get to the end of the book is the section on Will Eisner's The Spirit. Of Will Eisner's spirit stories ends with two consecutive. No, wait, not two consecutive. Two sections that are kind of now called in retrospect the outer space spirit, where Eisner had kind of taken himself out of the series pretty much at this point, and even. In the first outer space story at the bottom of page 396, even acknowledges that pretty much that Jules Feiffer and Wally Wood are the creators behind this, and so Wally Wood took over the art on this, and it is of the artists that work for Eisner, he's the one whose style really emerges the most. Other artists really did a good job of mimicking. Guys like Jerry Grandinetti and so on did a good job of mimicking Eisner's style. But Wally Wood stuff looks like Wally Wood stuff. Not to say he's not influenced by Eisner. But anyway, so that ran for quite a few weeks, that outer space spirit story, and actually is what ends the spirit, and it ended on in the midst of that story. That story was never actually completed. If you do have I think it's the 26th volume of the Spirit Archives. Right. It includes the material that would have ended the story. Pfeiffer worked from he basically he worked from a layout where he'd fold a paper in half and kind of sketch out roughly what each page would look like in that layout. And then, so some of those survive for the next installments, and his script survives, I think, too. So we do know how the story would have ended, but Pfeiffer and Wood never actually finished it.
Yeah. God, we could have done an entire episode on just this new 75th anniversary collection of the Spirit. But before, and of course there are many other stories that we could discuss, some of the really great ones. I mean, one that I didn't get around to bringing up is The Killer from December 8th, 1946, where we actually do literally get to see things through the eyes of a killer.
And that's another. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, he gets inside of his head to where we look out of the eyes of this character. So, but you were going to say?
No, that I think that The Killer and 10 Minutes and 2 Lives are the best of the really experimental stories that Eisner messed around with, or I shouldn't say messed around with, but they were the stories in which the experiment went with the story very well.
Right.
So the idea of telling a comic story, it's not entirely from the first-person point of view, but it plays around with the idea of what the first-person point of view is like, to be inside somebody's head. I didn't mean to prematurely wrap up our discussion of this book. In fact, there was a couple things I wanted to say about the later stuff, and then maybe a final comment about about stuff that's missing. But the later stuff that shows up then afterwards, I mean, we've talked about the New Adventure stories and a bit about the Batman Spirit story, but one of the other in that New Adventure section is a bit of an oddity. That was an original story that Eisner did for the Kitchen Sink Spirit comic number 2 in 1973, which is a story that deals with Pagel and her, what we might call her ambiguous or ambivalent sexuality.
Yeah.
And it is kind of it was a shocking story. Back in the comic, the original comic that this appeared in 1973, Eisner wrote that this was a script that he found left over that he didn't publish in the original Spirit run, and that he was reproducing that. I find that really hard to believe, especially because Pagel at the beginning is clearly in a romantic relationship with another woman.
Right.
I cannot imagine that would have been something that Eisner would have considered doing between 1940 and 1952.
And if it was an original script that he had, there was a reason at that time that he didn't use it.
Yeah, maybe. But that's a really fascinating piece, I think. Again, one that is historically important as well.
Mm-hmm. And also in terms of the way that this is illustrated, this is much more in line with the Will Eisner that we know after 1978 or from 1978 on, with a contract with God, and then the other books that he came out with, because you find his use of, for the most part, I'm looking through this, I don't think that there's, but I think the very last page you have examples of outlined panels.
Right.
But other than that, you have the quote-unquote panels are basically images that are embedded into larger illustrations, or one kind of almost melts into the other. Mm-hmm. And the first page is a great example of this. And so I think that this is notable not only because of the subject matter and what you had mentioned, Pagel's sexual ambiguity or ambidextrousness, I guess, but it's the fact that this is an illustration style that is markedly different from almost every other original Spirit story that he created in this collection.
Yeah, and so it stands out as another kind of piece in the puzzle and the steps that lead Eisner to the style that he uses, as you said, from 1978 on. So clearly he was thinking about that, right? Mm-hmm. In 1973, he was already thinking about, as he's coming back to comics coming back to, mainstream or whatever comics from doing the PS magazine for the military, where he was doing comics, but if you weren't in the military, you weren't seeing them. Right. That he was already kind of thinking about experimenting with his style in that way. So that's interesting.
Right, yeah, before the 1970s, really, for that period, in, like, say, the 1950s into the early 1970s, you have Will Eisner, more or less, the businessman, more than you do Will Eisner, the comics creator. Mm-hmm.
So can I say a couple things about stuff I'd like to have seen in here?
Sure. Because there's a lot, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's a lot, and so I want to just hit on a couple things and not be too picky here, because I think there would have been room for a couple more stories that we mentioned before, that there's several stories here that are important for their role in continuity within the Spirit. And in fact, even though some of these individual short stories stand out as short stories, the series was actually pretty continuity heavy. There's one story in here called Foxet Bay, in which the Spirit gets shot in the legs, shot in both legs. And if you were reading the original sections, for the next few weeks, the Spirit is on crutches. Mm-hmm. And so those stories, and so we don't get any of those stories in here, but we see that when the Spirit got injured, that injury continued into later stories. So anyway, so there is some continuity. There's a lot of continuity that goes on in the series. There's a few stories that I think are important within that continuity that I would have liked to have seen. One of them is As Ever Orange, which is a story from 1946 in which Eisner kind of writes Ebony out of the series for a little while, where Ebony is confronted by a woman he falls in love with named As Ever Orange, who criticizes his speech patterns. Mm-hmm. And so Ebony asks the spirit to send him to school so he can learn to speak better. And I think that's one of the stories that's historically important because Ebony is such a controversial character. That is a story in which Eisner kind of acknowledged that. However, Ebony comes back just a couple months later, and his speech hasn't changed all that much, and nor has his appearance. And he was replaced by a character called Blubber, who is an Eskimo. And so maybe a Blubber story in addition, or the story in which Ebony comes back and Blubber goes back to his home, are good stories in and of themselves, but they're important within that particular context, especially the problematic nature of Ebony. And then one other story in relationship to that subject is a two-parter called Hoagie the Yogi, in which the spirit teams up with an African-American detective who's drawn in a different style from Ebony, who's drawn in a more realistic style. And Eisner always cited that story as an example of him kind of rethinking how he was depicting race. And that character does come back again later. Now I'm drawing a blank on what that character's name is. I should know. But anyway, that there's those examples that directly address the controversial nature of Ebony, that if you don't see stories like that, you kind of think that Ebony is kind of treated unproblematically throughout this book.
I'm glad that you brought this up within the context of stories that could have been, or you would like to have seen, collected in this edition, and that makes perfect sense. Because I was going to say that one of the things we should address at some point, basically, two issues for me is the Ebony issue, so dealing with issues of race, but also along with that, even though it's a separate issue, issues of gender and the way that Eisner represents women, especially as femme fatales, because there's a whole slew of them, and not all of them are here in this collection. So, but yeah, there are, now we do get Sammy in some of the later stories, and in fact, in the story The Candidate, there is a little bit of overlap between Ebony and Sammy, even though outside of the first page, I don't know if Sammy and Ebony interact as they do in the recent #1 issue from Dynamite. But you do see them together on the splash page. So someone unfamiliar with the history of the spirit, and then they see Ebony toward the beginning and then Sammy at the end, and they really don't know about some of the controversy of the time and also later in more contemporary times surrounding the representation of Ebony or someone like an Ebony, may not get the complete picture, or at least could have gotten the fuller picture by the inclusion of those stories that you reference. Yeah, exactly. And now Ebony also goes away for a while and then comes back towards the end, and so some of the later Spirit in Outer Space stories, when they cut to or whatever what's going on in Central City while the Spirit's in outer space, Ebony and Sammy are interacting. So Ebony's there at the very end. He goes away for a while, but he's there at the very end. He has a couple kind of sabbaticals from the series, and then comes back. So that there's, I think, if we're dealing with contextual issues or continuity issues, those stories would have been good. You brought up the sexism or the gender issues. I always wonder if that second story in this collection, The Prom, is only included because it's got the splash page of the Spirit spanking Ellen.
which is a kind of famous splash page. And I wouldn't want to say iconic, but a famous splash page in the history of the Spirit. But because that story isn't that great compared to others.
No, but maybe for that spanking splash page alone, we can ask Craig Yo next time we have him on if maybe he would consider getting the rights to reproduce this splash page, if nothing else, we would love.
Kitchen Sink did it. I think it was Kitchen Sink. Somebody in the 70s did a Spirit coloring book. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
No, I haven't.
And it's made up basically of splash pages that you could color, but that one's in there.
Oh,
so,
cool.
If you were a kid in the 70s and wanted to color a picture of a man spanking a grown woman, you could have done that.
Yeah. And, this issue of Ebony, and this is something that, for those of us who absolutely love not only the Spirit but Will Eisner, this is one of those parts of Eisner's history that is a little difficult to get around, or there's no way of getting around it. And to me, it's very similar to the way that Mark Twain represented Jim, and not just in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I mean, yeah, he does show Jim in a variety of places as very human. On the other hand, there's another side to Jim where, especially in Kimball's illustrations for the original Huckleberry Finn, where he does come across as a minstrel figure, and then we know historically that Mark Twain absolutely loved minstrel shows. And so there's this two-sidedness to Twain and the way that he deals with not just Jim, but also with African-American issues. Somewhat similar to the way that there's a two-sidedness to Eisner in the way that he represents Ebony White.
Yeah, except that with Eisner, I always felt like when other comics were getting rid of their racial caricatures or changing them, he really never changed Ebony.
Right,
he took them out for a little bit, but he never changed the visuals, and that it. As much as Ebony may have been a beloved character and a partner with the Spirit, which were kind of the arguments that Eisner and others made in Ebony's defense, the visual appearance never changed, and that is always going to be an unanswerable problem, or an unsupportable, I guess, or indefensible problem in the Spirit books, whereas I think that Jim in Huckleberry Finn has much more complexity and ambivalence about him.
Right. Oh, I agree, and I think, and it's interesting. I mean, I didn't want to suggest that I equate Twain and his representation of Jim with Eisner's and his representation of Ebony, because I mean there are different things going on there. I mean, the fact that Huckleberry Finn is a prose narrative gives Twain quite a bit more liberty and space to flesh out character in ways that Eisner, working within a fairly limited page space, dealing with visual medium, especially when you're talking about the visuals being stereotypically iconic in the way that they are, Twain doesn't fall into the same trap. And when Twain in Huckleberry Finn does fall into that trap, in many ways it's linked to Kimball's visuals, the illustrations for the novel. But again, it's the Ebony that's hard to get around, and and I think that, I mean, we can try to kind of explain it away. And I know Eisner said himself that he got a lot of letters from African Americans who say that they appreciated the way that he had, a main character who was black. Now, that still doesn't excuse everything in terms of Ebony White. But I think ignoring it or trying to explain it away doesn't do Eisner, the Spirit, or comics any justice. And so I don't think just because we absolutely love Will Eisner and the Spirit, we can't turn a blind eye to this.
Yeah, I think that there's one of the things we're getting into is the way kind of fandom tends to create hagiographies about the creators, and that that it's difficult for some to reconcile the idea that Eisner is this great creator who did groundbreaking work and yet wasn't able to apply that same groundbreaking idea, I guess, or spirit, not to use a pun, to a character like Ebony, or to other racial caricatures that he did display throughout the run of the Spirit. That seems irreconcilable, and so some fans who really have a hard time seeing Eisner as having feet of clay in this particular area will try to come up with an explanation for Ebony that fits it in with that model of Eisner as this figure who's pushing the medium forward and resisting conventions in all these other ways. But I think the better way to approach that is to address the problem directly and see that, yes, this is a problem. And it may be something that turns readers off and makes them say, I'm not reading that. And I think they're entitled to that.
Right, they're entitled to that. Although the flip side of the argument that we're making is that by seeing this as an excuse to completely dismiss the Spirit or all of Eisner, I think is probably even a bigger sellout. So, I mean, it's an issue. We need to confront it. We need to discuss it, but not use it as a way of completely dismissing this creator. And we can say that with other artists as well throughout comics history.
Or throughout history.
History, yeah.
We all have to deal with Ezra Pound and D.W. Griffith, so on. But again, I would say though, if somebody were to say I can't read the Spirit because of Ebony, I would totally understand that. I don't know about someone saying, the Spirit shouldn't be considered a part of any kind of comics canon or whatever because of Ebony. I don't know if I would support that, but I would understand somebody saying this fits into a history that is, even if Eisner's intentions were good, has been damaging.
Yeah, and this is something that he writes about in a later work at the very back of Fagin the Jew.
Yeah.
He references his representation of Ebony as something that he's had to wrestle with since the original Spirit stories, and then he points out that one of the things that helped him confront this, or at least acknowledge it in public, is the representation of Jews visually.
Yeah.
And the stereotypes, and he includes several of those kind of images at the very end of Fagin the Jew, because it's important to note that later in his career he became much more, if not much more conscious, then much more public about his Jewishness and his past and where he comes from. So that becomes very much a part of the work where it's completely absent in the Spirit, at least overtly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I just want to mention two other things, if I can,
sure.
Really quick. So in the
spanking, that wasn't one of them.
The spanking was in the later section, in that new adventure section. I would have liked to have seen reprinted there the new origin story that Eisner did when Harvey was reprinting Spirit Comics in the 1960s. Again, more for that historical period than for its importance, because it is also a completely different origin story from when from the one we get at the beginning. So it may have been confusing. They do reprint the Alan Moore and Daniel Torres story from the Spirit New Adventures #3, but the Spirit New Adventures #1 was 3 short stories completely done by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, and they all deal with the Spirit's origin in one way or another, but there's at least one of those stories that I think would have even maybe been better than I dreamed of last night. I dreamed of Dr. Cobra, and then finally, in the last Spirit series that DC did, there was a black and white Spirit short story at the end of each issue, and one of the last ones that they did was a story by Will Pfeiffer and P. Craig Russell, in which the Spirit is fighting some bad guys, some thieves in a modern art museum, while a tour guide is giving a tour and describing all the different modern art styles. And each fight scene that the Spirit is engaged in actually kind of mimics the art style that's being described. Mm-hmm. And it's a really clever and very, very Eisner-esque story that I thought was a great homage to Eisner, and I would have liked to have seen that in here. There's probably 20 other stories I want in here, but those are the ones that stood out to me.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you, of the Darwin Cook Spirits stories, I mean, what do you think about the inclusion of his and Jeff Loeb's Batman Spirit crossover?
You know, that's a fun story.
It's a fun story, but I mean, do you think that maybe at least one other of the later Darwin Cook Spirit stories should have been included as well, or would you like to have seen it, or maybe one of those instead of this Batman Spirit crossover?
I don't know of instead, but yeah, I definitely would have liked to. You know, Darwin Cook did 12 issues of the Spirit series, and there's a couple of those issues that I think would have been great to include. The very first issue probably would have been the one I would have thrown in there.
Yeah. And, you know, I think we mentioned this last week when we were talking about the new Dynamite Spirit series, that, you know, something, because we were talking about Dan's art, which is, you know, pairs very well with the original Eisner Spirit. But I think that, you know, Darwin Cook, even though his art in many ways is strikingly different from Eisner's, on the other hand, there are things about it that are very Eisner-esque. Yeah. And another link between Cook and Eisner, and this gets back to the women issue that I brought up earlier. I think both Eisner and Darwin Cook are absolutely outstanding in representing and illustrating very sexy women. At the same time, I don't think that you could call either of their art cheesecake in the way that you usually would call art that does that with women. But I was thinking of that again when you mentioned that earlier story of the April Fools and the way that Byline, that guy, is drawn. And you can have certain characters in the original Spirit that look very cartoony, outlandish, almost in a Will Elder manner, inhabiting the exact same story as a stunningly sexy and attractive and much more realistically drawn, let's say, woman, or even a male figure. And I think it's that juxtaposition of different style that you find in a lot of these Spirit stories that just mark this as is something very important, something that we do need to read and just see the virtuosity of Will Eisner, not only as a storyteller, but also as an illustrator.
Yeah.
And when it comes to femme fatales, I mean, if you take out every story in this collection that has a female character, femme fatale or otherwise, that really stands out, you would have a much, much thinner book.
Yeah.
Again, there's so much more we could probably say about a celebration of 75 years, but this is definitely one of the most enjoyable reads for this year for me so far.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially, you know, if we look at it within a historical context.
Yep.
So you want to move on to the other title that we're discussing for this week?
Sure.
And this is Blazing Quantum, written and illustrated by William Keops Ibanez. And William, if I am mispronouncing your last name, please write and correct me, just as others have done in the past. But this is something that we actually received from William. He sent both of us this first issue of Blazing Quantum, and we've had it for about a month or two, and we've been waiting for a time to bring this up in the show. So now is the time.
Right, and you can find William's stuff on his website, Plastic Ketchup Bottle.
Right.
PlasticKetchupBottle.com. And so this is a mini comic. It's actually a pretty thick mini comic, 64 pages. It's the first issue. It was done in 2011, but he's still got copies and is selling it. And actually, it's a series of short stories that go back even further than that. I think the first story, Proletariat, is dated 2005.
Right.
So it is a group of short stories that focus on a character named Billy, who is a young Latino growing up in Texas, who is dealing with different aspects of his life that include working at his family's restaurant, going to school, and dealing with friends who are not necessarily the best students, and so on. So there's a lot of this comic that is about Billy's life, which is a very normal, it seems like, and realistic life. He also deals, though, with an abusive mother as well. So the fact that it's called Blazing Quantum Comics might seem odd. That if you're reading this and it's 64 pages and you're going through all these basically realistic slice of life stories, are these autobiographical stories about William Ibanez's own life, if the main character is Billy? And then at what point does this become Blazing Quantum?
Yeah. Now, it's interesting. You said a moment ago, abusive mother. I don't think you meant that in an entirely negative sense, like someone who beats and abuses psychologically as well as physically her son. At least
I did mean that. Because she hits him several times.
Okay, see, I took that as the kind of hyperbole and exaggeration with actions that we're used to seeing in comics, especially more comedic and funny comics, even though this is not necessarily a comedic, funny comic. I mean, they're light moments. But I just see her as kind of a stern mother, and I get that not only from kind of excusing these slaps that every now and again she gives him as kind of a comic over-exaggeration. And maybe they're not. Maybe I'm misreading there. But also at one point, Billy does point out how important his mother is to not only his life, but the life of the family. And so she's someone that we can see at the very beginning in this first story that you'd mentioned, Proletariat. She comes across as very stern, makes him work at their business, which is a restaurant. Not the nicest of mothers, doesn't leave him a lot of liberty, doesn't let him get away with much of anything. But then soon after, this is when he is home and he's with his brother, he's pointing out how much the mother means. So she's basically the glue that holds the family together. At the same time, though, you're right, she does literally hit him a number of times. I wouldn't necessarily call that abusive. If he had... in the strictest sense, I think if he had shown her to be much more of a monster and didn't have those more, I guess, understanding words that explain what she means to him, I'd be more apt to say she's abusive. So I'm a little reserved on the word abusive, though.
Okay.
Because other characters in this story are also kind of violent at times.
Yeah, But I mean, she does take off her belt and beats him and his brother with the belt. So
okay, that's true. That's true.
But you're right in that Billy does say as in some of the narrative boxes, which seem to be kind of retrospective, that that despite those moments where she did lose her temper like that, that she was a good mother who tried very hard. So I think what we're seeing there is more of a really kind of complex relationship between the son and the mother. So if I use the term abusive, I did mean that, but I don't mean that she's one-sided, a kind of one-sided monster character. She does resort to physical abuse at times, but she also does do good things. So there's a complexity to that character.
Yeah. Now, in one of these stories, and this is La Sierra. This begins almost in the slapdag middle of this 64-page book. This is a story that takes place earlier in Billy's life.
Right.
Because he's with his mother and they're going into Mexico, and I guess she's a doctor, or at least she has some kind of medical experience, because that's why they're bringing her in. And I did not get that she had that kind of medical background in the first story, Proletariat, because she was a businesswoman. She could be both.
Right. And at the end in of the second story, Dr. Ramos, we do get that large panel of her,
stitching up the arm. That's right.
Stitching up the arm, which so indicates that there's some medical background that we haven't been privy to yet, right?
Oh, that's good. I'm glad you pointed that out. I forgot about that.
Yeah, and so La Sierra is an oddly placed story too, because Billy is, I think, 4 years old in that story or so, and he's pretty young, unless she's chastising him for being young. Or being like a 4-year-old. She says, "I doubt a 4-year-old like you could handle it." But I think this story takes place before even the first story.
Oh yeah, Exactly. What threw me was the fact that we're getting these stories of him as a teenager, and then he is being carried on the back of someone. He's basically strapped to a chair, and someone is carrying him in the chair. It's like, is that possible? How big is this guy? But he's a little boy there.
Yeah. So and I think that the one of the things I really liked about this book is these slice of life stories, and really the representation of a world that does not get enough representation in comics. So I think it's interesting that we're talking about this book and the Spirit together, and that there's a wide no two books could be more dissimilar, but I think in terms of looking at this as a book that really is a strong representation of a culture in the United States that is notoriously underrepresented in comics, with maybe the exception of a few things here and there. The stuff that, or the exception of the stuff that Frederick Louis Aldama talks about in "This Is Your Brain on Latino Comics."
Right.
This would fit in right there with that work.
Yeah, exactly. And there is, throughout most of these stories, not all of them, throughout most of them, though, there is a very discernible, not just Latino, but I think Chicano, because the emphasis is on the Mexican-American link, and in fact, toward the end, in one of the later stories, the very last one, Ibanez brings in Mexican history and Mexican-American history, and I think that's very important. But there's one story, and actually it's one of my favorites, and this is Nos Vemos en Noviembre. And this is one of those stories that is about him in high school. He has a friend, you mentioned earlier some of his friends may not be the most model students. He seems to be a pretty dedicated student, not necessarily a nerd, but maybe he is, who knows. Kind of straight-laced. And there's this one character, I guess we could call it a friend of his. Oh, what's his name? Dean.
Yeah, Dean.
And it's Dean. And Dean wants Billy to help him with his physics homework so that he could pass. And in the way that this ends is, I think, quite striking because it does end on a foreboding note because he mentioned something about Dean going into the military, which is strange because the Dean that we see in this story, and Billy tells us in the narration, you wouldn't think that the military would be for his friend because he's someone who's a self-professed anarchist, but yet he goes in the military. But then he says, but what could happen to him in the military? It'll just straighten him out. We're not in any wars. And this is in the last panel when Billy is watching the debate between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And, of course, we know what happens after that election and America's presence on the battlefield. So there's that. But another reason why this story stands out to me is, you mentioned a community that is very underrepresented in comics. I think you and I both know that probably the best example of this Latino-Latina culture in American comics, it comes through the Hernandez brothers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things that's so fabulous about the Hernandez brothers, and I know we always talk about them on this show, and for good reason, and for a variety of reasons, is not only the way that they represent Latino-Latina culture, but the way that they normalize it to where it's no different from white culture in America. In fact, there are a variety of things that go on with both Jaime and Gilbert stories that could conceivably come right out of Archie, because they make it seem that there's nothing ethnically specific about it. They don't foreground it at times. And I think that the story, Fiend for Life, is one of those, because we see Billy here in high school. He has the same issues, the same problems, the same challenges that any high school student would have. And even though the Chicano presence is, I think, in the backdrop, in this particular story, it doesn't become prominent. So like the Hernandez brothers, the Latino, or in this case the Chicano culture is there, but it's not. Because it's been normalized to where why should we draw attention to it, or why should Ibanez draw attention to it specifically in this story? Because that does not become one of the mechanisms that moves this narrative forward. Unlike something like we find at the very end, and that is Los Dos Laredos.
Yeah, and that's the story where, in the final, really the final page, we get a sense of what the title Blazing Quantum might be meaning, because the series takes a very sharp turn from what seemed to be slice of life and possibly even autobiographical stories, because I see in the back that Ibanez has a brother named Andy, and the character Billy has a brother named Andy as well. So it makes me wonder just how much those stories are reflective of his life. And then I don't know, this is giving that much away. We get into the stuff about Mexican history and end up with time travel, and that's where the issue ends on a cliffhanger. So that raises another issue for me. Like I would recommend this book for the stories. The slice of life stories that we get in there. I think you do see a progression for Ibanez's storytelling and art through the book. And progression, I mean progress. The early stories have a few kind of storytelling hiccups in them, I think, that I had to go back and reread to kind of figure out some things that were going on. Whereas I think that his style and his storytelling ability gets better as the book progresses, and we can see this is a book he'd been working on for quite a few years.
I agree. Yeah.
And then, but it is, I think, worth pointing out that the book does end on a cliffhanger that if there haven't been new issues since 2011, we may not see the resolution of that story.
And in fact, Ibanez even mentions in his note toward the very end of this book that it does leave on a cliffhanger, and some of these questions will be answered. So, and in fact, Billy's not even a part of this last story because is that his brother Andy?
Yeah, his brother Andy and Dean are the main characters.
And so, they go to Laredo, and they go to, I guess, New Laredo, which is the Mexican side, across the river. And while they're there, they're having fun because, as the narrative points out, it's easier to get alcohol over there. Things are a little looser, it seems, and they're having a good time. Some guy on the street gives them a bottle of something, and we don't know exactly what it is. And when I saw it, I just assumed at first it was like malt liquor or something, because this is one of those kind of bottles, oversized bottles. But then there's something about it that puts them out to where they wake up somewhere else, and they don't know how they got there, and that they're in a situation that they don't know how to get out of, and that's that cliffhanger that you'd mentioned. So some of these questions are going to be answered, I hope, soon, because I would like to see the continuation of this story. So, William, thank you for sending us this first issue of Blazing Quantum. You've whetted our appetite, but with great gifts like this also come great responsibilities. So you need to follow up. We want to know what happened.
Yeah, and if you do go to his website, which is now Cheops Ibanez, though if you go to plasticketchupbottle.com,
it takes you right there. Yeah,
take you right there. There are stories under the comics tab that are for the second issue of Blazing Quantum. So there, someone were to order this first issue from his site, they could actually see some follow up.
Right, because there is, True Stories from Laredo is one of those. Yeah,
that doesn't seem to be a part of the Blazing Quantum story, but one at least one of the other. There's two. It looks like two color stories from this issue, and then one from Blazing Quantum 2.
Right, yeah. El Coraje de Mama, and I do not speak Spanish, and so I'm sure I'm butchering that.
That's why I'm not saying the titles either, because I don't want to butcher the titles.
I'm trying.
Yeah, no, it's good. You're good. You try. I'm a chicken.
So I'm wondering if the next issue of Blazing Quantum will be in color.
I don't know, or maybe online.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think there's a lot of promise here, and again, this is several. Some of these stories go back 10 years, so if there's newer material, then hope to continue to see progress in this.
Yep. So again, check out William K. Ibanez, and you can find more information on his work by going to plasticketchupbottle.com or Cheops Ibanez. That's KEOPSIBANEZ.com.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, we did span quite a bit of territory today, Andy. We started off with Will Eisner's The Spirit, a celebration of 75 years, quite a big tome. And then we discussed issue number 1 that William sent us of Blazing Quantum.
Yeah, this has been a marathon, so let's wrap it up.
Okay. You know, if you want to find great comics, kind of like the ones that we discuss on our show every week, you have to go to the website of our sponsor, and that's Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. Or if right now, as you're listening to this, you go to their sister company, which is In Stock Trades, that's instocktrades.com, you can find Will Eisner, The Spirit, a celebration of 75 years for a whopping 42% off. So instead of paying $49.99, you will pay $28.99. And definitely a great discount. That's a better discount that you're going to get other places like Amazon. So definitely check them out. In Stock Trades and Discount Comic Book Service. And then after you do get your copy of The Spirit, a celebration of 75 years at In Stock Trades, get in touch with us and let us know whether you agree with our analysis of the collection or not. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you will find a tab on the right-hand side of the browser that says Send Voicemail. And so please be like Dan, click on that and leave us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple to do. Or if you want to do like Carla, you can leave us a message by calling 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And then we have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to our blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 Guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on Tumblr, and on Google+. We also have a YouTube channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, and you can find every single one of our episodes as well as our reviews and our comics-related commentary that we put up on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right, all the way to get a hold of us and find out what we're doing.
So, be like a lot of other people lately and get in touch with us. Mm-hmm. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.